Oh, and good evening. It's March 20th, 2025, and welcome to another one of our branches on the vine with another series from the folks at Aleph Beta. I enjoy the connections across Scripture and the idea of putting ourselves in other shoes, sandals, and understanding these characters. I'm reminded that these were real people with honest agendas, and here at the Dusty Feet, we often try on sandals for the good and the not so good. So in this series from Rabbi David Fohrman, it caught my attention. Could you become Haman? I was intrigued by what I saw, and I thought we might want to discuss it. So here we go with, could we become Haman? This is our part 2 on the Dusty Feet. And before we forget, if you find these kinds of podcasts useful, click the subscribe button. Those reminders, they just help you. But also, if you think these might be useful to others, it is when you click that like button, because it is how YouTube chooses to share these to more people if they wish. So the Scroll of Esther, it's an interesting story. It's one of the 2 scrolls, remember, in this collection of scripture that never mentions God by name, the other being the Song of Solomon. Remember, did you realize that the name of God's never mentioned in either of them? Yet the story and the history behind this scroll, I think it's worth our time. I still expect this to be a 3-part series, maybe 4, as we explore the history, the cultural connections that put us into this story about Esther, and in that, the rescue from attempted genocide. So let's pick up where we left off with episode 3 of this series. So listen to the story that Rabbi Fohrman unveils. Enjoy.
Okay, let's go back to that strange statement the rabbis make where they say that there's a hint to Haman within the story of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Hamin ha'etz. Was it from the tree that I told you not to eat from, that you in fact ate? The rabbis seem to be identifying Haman with Adam right after he'd eaten from the tree. What evidence do they have to suggest this? Is there something about Haman's behavior that reminds you of Adam's behavior when eating the forbidden fruit? So let's try this on for size. Remember Adam in the garden? God had elevated Adam above all the other creatures of the world, all the other animals. And God, the King of Kings, had given Adam everything. Mikol eitz agan achol tochel, God had told Adam. From all the trees of the garden, you may surely eat. Paradise is open to you. There's just one thing you can't have. It's the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Don't touch that tree. That's my special tree. And then what happens? Adam and Eve, who've just been allowed to eat from any possible tree, go and just head for the one thing they can't have. It's almost like it all means nothing to them. All of those trees you could have, we don't even have any evidence that they ever ate from one of them. The only thing that mattered to them was the one tree they couldn't have. Now, who does that remind you of in the Megillah? You got it. That is Haman. He was a man elevated above all the other king's servants. He was given power, just as man in the original garden was given power over all. But here's this man who has everything, and listen to what happens. On his way out from the palace one day, as everyone bowed to him, out of the corner of his eye he spied Mordecai, one person who wouldn't bow. And he becomes enraged. He comes home and gathers all his close friends and family. Vayisaper lahem Haman. Haman told them at Kvod Oshro how rich he was, V'rov banav, how many children he had, that Kol asher gidlo hamelach, and how the king had elevated him, that asher niso al hasarim v'avdei hamelach, how the king had brought him above all of the other servants of the kingdom. Vayomer Haman, and then Haman said, you want to hear how great I am? Af lo hivia Esther hamalka im hamelach. The queen didn't invite anyone else to this great feast that she's making, ki im oti, except for me. Gam lamachar ani karula im hamelach. Even tomorrow I'm going to eat with her again. Look at me. I've been exclusively invited to dine with the king. And then, shockingly, he says this. V'chol ze einenu shoveli, and none of this matters a whit to me. V'chol et asher ani ro'eh et Mordechai Yehudi yoshev b'shar melech. Every time I see Mordechai sitting there and not bowing to me, it all means nothing. This is the Adam situation with the forbidden fruit. I have everything, but it means nothing because there's one thing I can't have. You know, you gotta kind of feel sorry for the guy. Listen how pathetic he is. He's calling together his wife and family to tell them about how many children he has, how much money he has. It's like he's trying to desperately convince them of his wonderfulness. And he really does have everything. What was the pinnacle of everything for Haman? It was, I was called to dine with the king. You know, that was just like Adam too. Adam's great gift is the ability to dine with the King of Kings. He's there in God's garden and has all these fruits, all these trees that God made. If he would eat of them in God's presence in the garden, what's he really doing? He's dining with the king. Both of these people are in exactly the same position, but it all means nothing to them because of the one thing they can't have. How sad. But I don't think that's all. I think there's more. Let's see if the continuation of that story continues to remind us of the Tree of Knowledge episode. So the next thing that happens is that Zeresh, Haman's wife, responds to him. She says, Ya'asu eitz gavoa 50 amah. Why don't you make a gallows 50 amot high? Ubaboker amor el hamelech. And in the morning you'll go to the king and you'll ask him permission to hang Mordechai on it. And you'll have the one thing that so far eluded you. What does that remind you of in the garden? Adam was offered the fruit, the forbidden fruit, the one thing he couldn't have, by Eve. And now Haman's wife, Zeresh, tells him, well, why don't you just have the one thing that you haven't been able to have? Then isn't it interesting what the gallows are called in Hebrew? Yasu eitz, literally an eitz is not a gallows. You know what it is? It's a tree. It's the tree of knowledge all over again. It's the one thing you can't have. She's offering him the fruit. But what are the consequences of eating forbidden fruit? Back in the garden, the way the Ramban understands it, God was saying, on the day that you eat from it, you'll become a being that will eventually die. And that's exactly what happens to Haman. In his reaching for Mordechai, the one thing he can't have, he also becomes a being who's eventually going to die. He himself is hanged on those gallows at the end of the story. And why was he hanged on those gallows? Haman meets his end after Esther points him out as the villain who will destroy her and her people. The king is fuming. He goes back into his garden of all places to think things over. And when he arrives back, he's greeted by a certain member of the court named Harvona. I just need to tell you, King, that in the backyard of Haman's house, you know what there is? There's a huge gallows. He was trying to have that one last thing. He was trying to have Mordechai, asher diber tov al hamelech, Mordechai who had been loyal to you, who had been good to you. When the king hears this, that's the last straw. Tluhu alav, hang him on those gallows. The king's realization that Haman had reached for that fruit becomes the reason Haman will die. Okay, now having seen all of these Tree of Knowledge connections within the Haman and Zeresh story, I think we're now in a position to understand the very next scene in the Megillah in a much deeper way. What happens right after this little discussion between Haman and his wife over the gallows upon which Mordechai will be hanged? The king can't sleep. He asks for the book of records to be opened and read before him, and he hears about when Mordechai had saved him from an assassination plot, and he says, was there anything ever done to reward Mordechai for this? And the people say, no, there wasn't. And just then, he hears that there's somebody out in the courtyard, and who is it? And it just happens to be Haman. Haman is there to ask for Mordechai's head. The king says, bring in Haman, and the king says, what should we do with the man that the king wants to honor? Vayomer Haman belibo, Haman said in his heart, Who would the king want to honor more than me? Haman says to the king, Ish asher hamelech hafetz bikaro, the man the king wants to honor. Oh, yaviu levush malchut asher lavash bo hamelech, bring the king's clothes that the king has already worn. V'sus asher achav alav hamelech, and the horse that the king has ridden upon, asher nitan ketra malchut brosho, and that the crown of the king has been on the horse's head, and have one of the king's servants lead this person through the streets and say, thus shall you do the man the king wants to honor. I mean, you're the king, you're listening to this, you're thinking, it's just king, king, king. This guy wants my job. Haman's transparent desire to be king has never been more evident than this. And it's worth wondering why. Why is this the moment in the Megillah where he just can't contain his ambitions anymore? Well, the very last thing that happened is Haman built the gallows for Mordechai. He tried to have the one thing he couldn't have. What's the reason why you reach for the one thing you can't have? So you could pretend that you have no restrictions. So you could pretend that you are a king. The act of building the gallows for Mordechai is, in effect, the same thing as wanting to be king. It's wanting to be entirely unrestricted. So it's no wonder in the very next scene that Haman's obsession with being king simply can't be contained. And here, by the way, is the real tragedy of it all. He knows he's not king. He's just plain dress up. He's pretending to be king. He's fake king. Everyone's looking at him and said he's king. But that's Adam in the garden too, right? If you have the forbidden fruit, you think you're going to be king? Or are you going to pretend that you're the owner of the garden? It's all about pretending, if only for a moment, that all of it is mine, or that I have no restrictions. And if you think about it, that hope that we could just pretend that we have no restrictions, to pretend that you're a king, is not just about megalomania. It's not just that cartoonish character who says, it's mine, it's all mine. There's a reason why you want it to all be yours. There's a subtle but precious prize here to be gotten. You know what's really in it for you? What's really in it for you is that if it's all yours, if you're really the owner of the garden, if you could really pretend you're king, then there's no distinction anymore between the two kinds of good. Between good in the sense of what I want, and good in the sense of the way things should be. The two are the same. What I want is the way things should be. I'm king. And everyone would just love it if what you desired was the same as the way things ought to be. You never have to feel guilty about pursuing any desire. The good and the true and the just in your desire, it's all the same thing. You make the rules. And by the way, we see little bits and pieces of this everywhere in our own lives. It's the boss who treats everyone around the office like garbage, but no one can call him on it because he makes the rules. It's just the way it is. He doesn't have to feel guilty about it because that's the way it is. What he decides goes. This issue, this fantasy that you could just conflate the two kinds of good, that there would be no distinction between what you want and what's good and just and right. That, as we talked about in our first couple videos, is the real soul of the Tree of Knowledge challenge. It's that issue which Haman and Zeresh are struggling with, but it's not just them. The Megillah doesn't just include the bad guys, Haman and Zeresh. It includes good guys too, Mordechai and Esther. If the bad guys are struggling with this Tree of Knowledge issue, wouldn't the good guys in some way have to be struggling with it as well? Let's take a look at that in our next video.
Desire. It's an interesting word because it allows us to examine it dually, right? As we can examine it from both the positive side and from as an opposing point of view. I mean, the simple stuff's easy, like food, right? Like I said before, I desire mac and cheese. I like it. There's a desire. I also like sunshine. I like being out in the sun. I like looking at the creation that is all around me. I hope that's a good thing. But then there's the things that we shouldn't desire. That's usually where we drive this. I get it. When we always think in our own minds this way. So I'll roll with that here. There's a desire that we have that we should not be having, our own thoughts. What things hit me when we get to the Haman and adversary sides of this equation, I thought about this. I wrestled with it a bit. Because when I consider it in adversarial terms, I think the adversary desires really to be like God. He wants to be in the driver's seat, make all the decisions himself. The interaction with Jesus had a bit to show in that. His offer to Adam in the garden. I have this desire. You should have it too. So I'm okay with him having the desire, wanting us to have that desire. That just means we have to overcome the temptation to have that desire. One of the things I think about when it comes to this is maturity. I think that goes with the balance of desire. Whose will do I want? Are we even mature enough to understand that? I think we see it often. We see it in Scripture, goes round and round, and God constantly takes us back to verbiage usage, to examples, to analogies and metaphors that are all wrapped around family. We have pointed interactions between fathers, mothers, children. And when we see those, I think that's when we need to sit up, pay attention. Because God equates us to Him as our children are to us. So I think we have more to consider when we think about something so simple, such as whether we're mature enough to make the decisions we're making. Yeah? Of course I'm mature enough. I'm an adult. So I get to make those choices. Maybe that's the direction God's taking us in to look at. Maybe it's not even so much about mature. Maybe thinking maturely might guide us to a point of when we need to stop and ask. Because there's that strange point of stopping. Should I be doing this? I know I can fill in the blank, but should I? Then I look back at God's instructions. Because He gives me an idea of what should be important and what I should use to make those decisions, those important ones, my whole life. I think probably, of course, our most potent example in this was His Son, who constantly deferred to Him, deferred to God Father, said, yeah, again, it's not my decision. It's not my desire. It's not my choice. I want your choice. I want your decision. I want what you want that's best for me and others. Because we have people that speak in our lives. We speak into it. In this story, we see it's Eve's, right? We should listen, and maybe we should not listen, because we'll eventually reach the point of a term, of a role, right, who we should be leaning on if they're in that role. And we all know, I think we also need to be aware that they're responsible for that role. We're going to get to that role. It's going to be fun. We'll move on. So, we get to Haman, who desires something, right? This is interesting because in this story, we would say it's obvious, and yet in the story in the garden, I think there's probably more questions we can ask. But here, we're with Haman. He wants, the want drives him to make all the decisions himself, right? He wants to be the big guy. He wants to be the boss. He wants to be king. But if I can't be king, at least I'll act like I am. I'm going to make those decisions for myself anyways. And I thought about the garden again. God telling us things. He told us lots of things. It wasn't just the fruit. And the thing He tells us, I mean, that's just one thing that we couldn't have. But the stuff that we do have. He said, what we do, we have dominion. We should take care of it. Manage all the rest of creation. It wasn't just eating in this garden. It was the other things that we had to do. Take care of it. Master it. So even in that, the interesting question is, under what auspice are we doing this, right? It's interesting. Because then I question what guides me in doing what I do. There's a line from Jurassic Park. It's from Jeff Goldblum. It's one of my favorite scenes in all the movies. And he's talking to Hammond, right? And Hammond, he created this whole thing. He thinks he can control it. He thinks he can because I created it. So I can control it. And then he says, like, our scientists are doing this because we want to do this. We desire to do this. I know those aren't the exact words, but you can run them underneath, right? And then we'll follow Goldblum's response. Your scientists were so busy about whether they could that they never stopped to ask if they should. And I say this for what we do in creation. How do we take care of it? What do we do with everything from animals to trees? Can we? We can. Should we? That flips us back to Haman, who's in the position he can. Should he? And this is where we get that desire twist, because when things go unchecked, when they're not willing to put up our decisions against something, i.e., God's guidelines, then we get what we get. Haman wants that control, so he tries to take it. I can see the adversarial influence in this. Take it. It's yours. The gallows, the tree, the fruit. What you shouldn't have, but wanted anyways. Truthfully, we're put in a position of responsibility. I like that. But are we willing to be guided by somebody else? Are we willing to follow their instructions? It's evident in today's culture, probably has been for a while. This is nothing new. It's all about me. It's my choice. I get to make it. Me, me, me. My. That kind of thing. We don't like to defer power. I know, again, that's a broad stroke generalization because some people, they're very comfortable taking direction. They do very well in this role. Suits them. And that's a good thing. However, there are also many that dislike it because it conflicts. It's all about their choice. And I think one of our significant objections to Torah is that it cramps my style, impedes my life, doesn't fit me in my choices. While God's will was given to them, some have come up with the idea that God's will, his wisdom and direction, well, that stuff doesn't matter now. As you know, I tend to disagree with that. But we're back in the garden with an adversarial decision to listen to God. You know, I'm fascinated by the king and Haman's discussion. We'll probably eventually get to that part. Because it's not the perfect fit, because he's talking into our story here, and then we're using part of this for an analogy, right? Still, it does bring up some good questions, such as playing in the adversarial role. And God is saying, hey, this is one of mine, somebody I want to admire above the rest. It's not a power thing. Maybe it's more of a recognition, right? And God's saying this is what should be. But what we get is, okay, so the king wants to parade him, right? He gets that part, and that upsets the adversary. It upsets Haman. Another created being that in his view, the adversary, becomes maybe the apple of God's eye for a moment. And in that desire, there's an unhealthy part of the desire, the stuff we shouldn't have. Envy, jealousy. I want that role. I want to do this. I want to be that. So what better way than plotting the downfall of the person God wanted to address? He wanted to nurture. He wanted to care for at that time. So I love where the rabbi talks about wanting to be king with Haman, right? He's building the gallows, pushing the idea that he wants to be king. And I want to stretch this a bit here, because I did get an interesting thought, because I agree with him, but I also think that the adversary and Haman, I think they want to determine life and death. I think one of his drives here, the adversarial drive, is determine life and death. Who lives? Who dies? We look back at the garden. It's interesting. That wasn't one of the things God put in our original charge orders. It was not us to determine who lived and who died. That's not brought up. That's not our part. But when we decided not to listen to God, because that's his part of it, then he said, okay, if you want to figure that out without my guidance, exit the garden, stage left, and in that, yeah, you can figure out who lives and who dies. Excuse me? I think that's the very next story. But with that comes our demise. We didn't realize that this also meant ourselves. So I wonder if that element's going to play out in this story too. Haman knows he's not king. He's pretending to be king. He's dressing up to be king. We ate the fruit. Yeah, I said we ate the fruit, but we're not God. That's not within our purview. We're just pretending to be. By the look of things, maybe we should listen more carefully to the one who made the garden and wanted to stroll with us in the garden. But the distinction now that we think we get to determine what's good and not good. And again, I'm going to say it because I can. So I have chosen to say that what God said was good and not good, way he put it, that is essential. Because when we consider this, maybe we should pause and consider God's wisdom on how to live, his will, his words, even his son's words. But Haman, he's embracing the adversarial role. He's describing what he can do and how he can achieve it. And eventually, I promise we're going to discuss where he gets some of this energy, this impetus, this guidance. And I think that's going to help us see these two parallel stories so differently. You know, it's interesting. I don't want this to go a specific direction, so I want to make it like a short and sweet statement. But to remember that we don't have the right to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. That's not in the biblical story. While it does fit in our country, and it's part of the rules of the land, it doesn't fit in the Bible story. We don't have the right to life. God grants us life. We don't have the right to liberty. What we want to do is listen to God, do what God says. You know, it's funny, we even get a bit with Paul way down the line, thousands and thousands and thousands of years later. In his words, I'm free to be a bondservant. And the pursuit of happiness. I don't see that in the picture. I do see that we have the pursuit of God's choices. And in that, yes, then he says he's the one that can then tell us, if you do, then this can happen. And in that, the real bottom line is, it's about pursuing someone else's happiness through their happiness. And well, that'll fall on you. Does give us more to ponder. We have Haman and Zeresh and their dynamic. We'll get another couple and their dynamic as we talk about all the people involved in this. We're going to see inverses, mirrors, people acting in roles as they were intended to be. And then we'll get there again with some of our discussion. I'm looking forward to it. Because I think we're going to see how decisions made in the garden would have changed if they'd have been considered differently. Because if we follow this line in the story, we're going to have a different outcome. So as we get to the section next week, it's going to walk us there. I love that. We're going to see more of this dynamic struggle that goes on with the characters, the real life struggle that goes on with these characters. Be interesting to look at. So, thank you for being with us tonight on another Could We Become Haman? Thank you, Rabbi Fohrman and folks at Aleph for bringing it to us. We'll get to more next week on the Dusty Feet.
Yeah.